Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a very special post-spring break edition of the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I coordinate said forum, which happens almost every Friday in this very room. It's an initiative of the Humanities program, which gives you, the Providence College community, the opportunity to hear from scholars, from journalists, from experts from around the country, and indeed around the world, about the questions and the research that interests them. So here you get the chance outside of class to engage with new ideas, encounter new perspectives, deepen your appreciation for the humanities. I know that our guest today is British, and I remember when I was in England as a student, when I was in college, I went to a play in London, and they had special discount seats like in the very front row. And I could see that the actors produced immense volumes of spittle as they spoke, right? Just like clouds of mists of spit. Our guest today is not going to do that. So if anybody wants to sit closer, you're all hiding in the back. You can sit up here and you will not be spat on, not even a little bit. Before I pass this microphone off to people who have better things to say, let me give you a preview of what to expect. Well, you'll hear from our guest. At the end of which there's a period of about 20 to 25 minutes of questions and answers. And if you've been to one of these before, you know a student has to ask the first question. Ideally, a student asks every question, just boxes the faculty out entirely, but especially the first question. We're going to wrap up at 4:45 sharp, and afterwards there's a reception right down the hall in the great room with all sorts of tasty food and drinks, which gives you a chance to start your weekend right and to talk about what you've heard and what you're going to do and so on and so forth. So the only other things I would say in terms of guidelines are shut those screens down. You don't need them today. You can just use your ears and pencils and papers and be fully present in the room. And then when we get to the Q&A, make sure to wait, and you have that good question, wait for the microphone to get to you and just say what your name is, what your name, major, and then ask your question. Okay. I think that's all you need to know about the broad brushstrokes of today. So let me hand the microphone over to my fellow checkered shirt colleague, Dr. Travis Lacey.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I had no clue where the spit story was going, so he wrapped it up really nicely. But it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. For those of you who I have not met before, my name is Travis Lacey. I teach in the theology department here at Providence College, and I am the associate director of the C.S. Lewis Fellowship at Providence. The C.S. Lewis Fellowship is an initiative made possible through a generous donor to encourage teaching, reading, scholarship, and reflection on the life, writings, and thought of C.S. Lewis. The fellowship just sponsored a trip to Oxford that I know a number of undergraduates went on, sponsored by a couple faculty we have in this room. And the C.S. Lewis Fellowship is honored to co-sponsor the lecture today, given by Dr. Sarah Waters. Dr. Sarah Waters teaches at the Department of Language and Literature in Sterling College in Kansas. She completed her PhD at Oxford Brookes University. She wrote a dissertation in medical humanities and literature, comparing early modern discussions of melancholy with contemporary psychiatric treatments of depression. So Dr. Waters has an interest in interdisciplinary conversations, the very kinds of things we do in the humanities here. She has written several articles on C.S. Lewis and his often unacknowledged debt and nods to Shakespeare in his writing, which she'll be getting into today. She's also written on a number of Lewis's influences and interlocutors, such as Owen Barfield, George MacDonald, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, and on Shakespeare himself. She is a frequently sought-after speaker and has given keynote lectures on Lewis and Shakespeare, of course, also on Flannery O'Connor, on other aspects of early modern literature. She is a published poet, and she currently has a full monograph in preparation for Kent State University Press on Lewis and Shakespeare. One of the most exciting aspects of Dr. Waters' new post at Sterling College is that she is the director of their newly begun C.S. Lewis Center, which sounds like it is very harmonious with what we do in the fellowship here at Providence College. The C.S. Lewis Center at Sterling will be interested in promoting thought, reflection, the reading and scholarship and teaching on C.S. Lewis as well. In honor, I've also been told, of the C.S. Lewis Center, Sterling will be trying to build the largest lamppost in the world in honor of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, so that's interesting. And then aside from all of that, she is an avid cyclist and runner, and it is our pleasure to welcome her here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Waters.
Thank you very much. I wish the lamppost thing was more of a joke than it sounds. It's serious. So I'm going to be referring to some things on the screen, but I'll also be talking some. So don't worry if it doesn't advance. I haven't necessarily forgot it. So in February 1963, Lewis published an article in Show magazine, in an issue especially concerned with the space race. It was originally entitled Onward Christian Spacemen. It's now found anthologized under the title The Seeing Eye. In that same month, the Rocky Mountain News of Denver, Colorado, and specifically their religious editor, Wes French, reported on Lewis's publication, highlighting his use of Shakespeare and his characters as an analogy, and they summarized it in somewhat clunky terms. C.S. Lewis, that provocative British author and theologian whose unorthodox views and approach to religion has both titillated and taunted Christians for many years, is at it again. This time, in keeping with his penchant for bobbing up in the most unusual places, Lewis makes his appearance in Show, the magazine of the arts. In his article, Onward Christian Spacemen, Lewis doesn't think much of the Russian claim that there is no God because their astronauts didn't see him. But he isn't much higher on the prospect of a man treating, in a Christian fashion, possible rational beings living on other planets. Looking for God by exploring space is like reading or seeking all Shakespeare's plays in the hope that you'll find Shakespeare as one of the characters, Lewis writes. And the Rocky Mountain editor continues, if there were an idiot who thought plays existed on their own without an author, our belief in Shakespeare would not be much affected by his saying he had studied all the plays and never found Shakespeare in them. So says the editor. Regardless, it's true that Lewis in that essay uses Shakespeare, his stories and his characters in his plays as an analogy for us, the characters in God's story, searching for God, citing especially, as he had done throughout his life by this point, the example of it being like Hamlet searching for Shakespeare. Almost this exact example appears as early as his Great War with Owen Barfield in the 1920s, later in Pilgrim's Regress in 1933, and again later still in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Throughout his lifetime and career, Lewis used Shakespeare as an analogy to explain things and to help make things clear. As we'll see, Lewis did this in a whole series of contexts across genres and across his lifetime. In The Four Loves, Lewis writes, and this is the quotation if you saw the promotion for this particular talk that I used. Lewis says, I am driven to literary examples because you, the reader, and I do not live in the same neighborhood. We might conclude, if we'd already known Lewis pretty well, that the kind of literary examples he might have in mind might be things like Spenser, given he wrote Allegory of Love, or George MacDonald, based on the fact that Phantastes baptized Lewis's imagination, or even Balder, for the sonorous repetition which awoke something deeper in Lewis, as he tells us in Surprised by Joy. But he often also turns to Shakespeare. Specifically in The Four Loves, he turns to King Lear. But why Shakespeare? In this talk, I'm going to try and unpack this why. First, by showing Lewis's own knowledge of Shakespeare. Second, by showing how Lewis does this elsewhere in his canon, and turning back to the Four Loves example. And finally, exploring the deeply personal reason why Lewis was so connected to Shakespeare. Now, it isn't until 1918 that Lewis finally admits to his friend Arthur Greeves that he has learned to enjoy Shakespeare. But this isn't the whole story. In fact, earlier than that, in a letter from May 1910, when Lewis is only 11, he's already describing himself and his father as, quote, true Shakespearean students. And not just doing so, but when he does that, he also quotes a line from Richard II that he and his father know what happens after a well-graced actor leaves the stage. He's doing this to emphasize his point of their shared knowledge. And he knew that his father is going to get that reference. By the time we get to 1918, Lewis is telling Arthur Greeves how pleased he is with his very own copies of Shakespeare after he's purchased a complete edition of the larger Temple Shakespeare with, quote, malicious glee. His first love when it comes to Shakespeare's plays, or at least the love that he declares to Greeves, which might also appear perhaps to Greaves' own sensibility, are plays fitting the fantastical and the miraculous. He writes in 1916 that The Winter's Tale, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Tempest are, quote, the only things of Shakespeare I really appreciate. Later, as we'll see, he adds to this list, but he especially adds those plays which are struck by, where he is struck by the miraculous, where the boundaries of the possible and the impossible are being pushed, and where the wonder of resurrection is realized and then snatched away. Perhaps most notable additions include Hamlet and King Lear. Now, Lewis, of course, had to study Shakespeare himself. He writes of his study of Othello at Kirkpatrick's, for instance, in a letter to his father in 1915. An engagement with Shakespeare's works formed an integral part of Lewis's undergraduate studies in his crash course in English language and literature in 1922 to 23. This is after he's taken those earlier degree courses in honours, moderations, and grades. His English tutor was a professor called F.P. Wilson, who was a specialist in Elizabethan drama and specifically worked on the context of Shakespeare's period, especially the plague, and then later on Shakespeare's language as well. Wilson would later go on to write the drama volume which precedes Lewis's in the Oxford History of English Literature series, which is published posthumously. He also actually served as the general editor for that series too, and indeed was responsible for recruiting Lewis to write the volume that he did. And of course he went on to become Lewis's colleague in the English faculty as well, because of course they overlapped during that time as well. Now, after a general course on Shakespeare with G.S. Gordon twice a week in Michaelmas term, Hilary term, that's the spring term, was Lewis's really heavy early modern drama term. In that term alone, he had available to him courses on some plays of Shakespeare textual study with C.R.D. Young, compulsory textual criticism of Hamlet with Percy Simpson, Shakespeare the Tragedies with G.S. Gordon again, the drama 1603 to 1640, also with Simpson, and the history of some stage situations and some dramatic types in Elizabethan and Jacobean times with J. Spence. So he had a good grounding in Shakespeare, contextually, on a textual level, and he understood and situated Shakespeare amongst other plays and writers from his period. Lewis reported in his own diary that Gordon's lectures were very good. He notes, for example, in November 20th, 1922, that he heard Gordon on Shakespeare's language, declaring it to be a capital lecture. Thanks to his diary, we also know that papers on Shakespeare were also brought to the regular discussion classes that undergraduate English students were expected to attend and contribute to during Lewis's time there. As part of his finals for English, Lewis undertook exams on the age of Shakespeare and Shakespeare and Milton. He reports in his diary that these did not go in his favour, though we might remember that he did graduate with a first-class degree, so they can't have been that bad. He set himself very high standards, I think. The volume of classes that Lewis took on Shakespeare, which were either available to him or required of him to take, offer a kind of baseline context for his scholarly engagement with Shakespeare. This engagement, I suggest, was to continue throughout his life. By the summer of 1924, he's already marking school papers on Shakespeare while he's still a philosophy tutor, and this is actually something he continues to do throughout the 1920s. A year later, as he learns of the news of his appointment at Magdalen College, Oxford, as a tutor in English with a continued sideline in philosophy, he blends in Shakespearean references in his report of his news, the news of this position to his father. There we go, that's one of his exciting questions that he set his students. So, he writes a very, very long letter. I'm only giving you the kind of choice portion here. In this quotation, which you can see up on the screen, he mentions Macbeth by allusion and also throws in Hamlet. In both cases, though, the title of the play is not mentioned, and it depends upon the reader of the letter's knowledge both of these plays and the particular context where those lines are being pulled from. The joke comes across without that knowledge, but it carries extra layers if you know these contexts. And these are missed by unhelpful footnotes which accompany them in their appearance of this particular letter in the collected letters. The editor there, Walter Hooper, notes that Lewis is citing Macbeth Act 1, Scene 5, line 1, and he says that Lewis has slightly misquoted this line. On one level, the editor is correct. He has misquoted the line. On another, the implication is entirely unhelpful. The point here is that intentional adjustment or adaptation of the quotation. Misquoted erases the intentionality with which Lewis is playing with quotations he and his father already know well. He knows the real lines. He's rewriting them for his own context and his own purposes. So the letter begins in very dramatic fashion. And though Lewis assures his father that he is not, quote, writing it up to an exciting conclusion, it certainly seems as though he is. These exciting conclusions include an ominous thunderstorm and, quote, a nasty morning, which rose up to a grey, clammy morning where one sweats every time one moves, and the big blue bottles settle on your hands. All of which, to those familiar with the horrible portents of ill news, or merely pathetic fallacy, which both the tragedies of Hamlet and Macbeth are filled with, have those echoes there. And then he quotes these plays directly. But they're easily missed, hidden in an almost unbelievable anecdote. The image is ridiculous. Lewis is describing the fact that he, on the same day that he received this exciting news that he's got this new post, came across a cat attacking a dog, rather than perhaps a more likely reverse. And on noticing this, decided that he would single-handedly intervene and separate the sharp teeth and claws of the cat from the equally sharp teeth of the small dog. Even more interesting than the ridiculous image this portion of the letter leaves us with is the fact that he begins and then continues his Shakespearean allusion. As the word allusion implies, though these quotations, Lewis is also nodding to the original context where they appear, not just to signal hyperbole, or even a sharp shift from tragedy, thunder and so on, to comedy, a cat-dog fight, to tragedy, mighty opposites. The original quotation, the Macbeth quotation that we see up on the screen here, that's the first one, a cat met me in the day of my success. That originally comes from a scene where Lady Macbeth is reading a letter from her husband relaying his meeting of the three weird sisters. And the original quotation reads as follows: "They met me in the day of success." So he's added a word. The success referred to is one in battle, and the very same where Macbeth is made Thane of Cawdor. He has yet to return home from the fight, and he's relaying this news to his wife, and the strange happenings that have passed. The quotation, as used by Lewis, is only really minorly adjusted. He's adding that word "my." But it's clear that Lewis is changing the Shakespeare quotation in order to insert his story into Shakespeare's story and language, adapting those words of Lady Macbeth from that original quotation. Remember also, he's writing a letter here, relaying the outcome of his own battle for the job, as well as breaking up the cat and dog fight, I guess, to one who has not yet received the news. The multi-layered reference includes Lewis's intent to recall in the mind of his reader, first his father, that self-same letter of that Lady Macbeth reads, with its news and possible future implications for further greatness as well as continuing the fated atmosphere which he's importing from that same story. So, one such example is something he does very frequently. Now, once he began working at Magdalen, Lewis himself would have to prepare his own students for those same Shakespeare courses he himself had undertaken. And I've tracked this by working through the examination statutes at Oxford, which include the subject matter and, in the case of Shakespeare, particular texts which were to be assessed for each final year. And alongside this, I've worked very closely with Lewis's own copies of Shakespeare, of which he had many, not just the temple one that he spoke of with so much glee to Greaves, and a whole variety of different editions within those, and in which, in those editions, either his handwriting or his handwritten dated note indicates close alignment of readings with the dates in which particular texts were being taught or assessed. So, in the year Lewis took his English degree, specific Shakespeare plays were not yet specified in the statutes. But from 1928 to 1929 onwards, there were significant shifts in the English syllabus at Oxford, which meant that the paper Shakespeare and Milton became known as Shakespeare and Contemporary Dramatists, and the paper Age of Shakespeare was totally eliminated. One immediate result of this was the introduction of particular plays as focus text for the Shakespeare paper. An easy example to illustrate how we can precisely determine Lewis's scholarship and preparation for teaching Shakespeare comes with the early play Two Gentlemen of Verona. Not a play that Lewis published on, aside from a letter to the Times Literary Supplement late in 1950. But a play that he read at least twice in the space of a couple of years, and a play of which he had at least 3 editions, all of which include annotations. So he notes in his Arden edition of that play the month and the year he completed his reading of that play, September 1931, followed by March 1933. Writing the date when he completed the reading of a text was not an uncommon habit of Lewis's, and indeed we find it not just in his Shakespeare editions, but across volumes in his personal library. One notable example of this outside of Shakespeare comes from one of his editions of John Donne's poetry. He had a 2-volume edition, and the final poem is To Christ. This is a final stanza of that poem. More moving still, perhaps even than this final stanza, is the date on which Lewis finished reading this particular volume. December 31st, 1932. After Christmas and approaching the new year as a newly emerging Christian. Lewis's note of September 1931 in Two Gentlemen of Verona, when he was, as we shall see later, reading rather a lot of Shakespeare's plays, and then March 1933, make even further sense when we find out that this very same play, Two Gentlemen of Verona, is amongst the Shakespeare titles for examination in the year 1935. Now, you might be wondering why in 1935? Well, that's because that's when the final exams will be sat by the students who are first starting to engage with that play from 1932 onwards. So he's preparing for his classes. That's at least in part why he's reading this text. The text for that paper rotated for each cohort. But it wasn't just in tutorials where Lewis was teaching Shakespeare. In the academic year, 1936 to 1937, for 2 consecutive terms, the lecture lists in the Oxford Gazette show that he team-taught a lecture series on Hamlet. The first term, he worked alongside C.L. Wren, Neville Coghill, and Hugo Dyson. And in the second term, a certain J.R.R. Tolkien also joined their ranks. This series began in the same year when Lewis's allegory of love emerged and solidified his reputation as a medievalist. And he became famous for his work on medieval literature, which was usually his primary responsibility when it came to lectures for the English faculty, particularly a series called Prolegomena to the Study of Medieval Poetry. But alongside this, as the Hamlet series shows, Lewis was also working on other writers, including notably Shakespeare. In 1938, the Gazette notes that during Michaelmas term, Mr. Lewis and others gave a lecture series on Shakespeare. Moreover, Lewis also worked on Shakespeare with graduate students at Oxford. His importance, indeed, in the English faculty came in part from his running of and responsibility for the textual criticism classes for B.Lit, that's essentially a kind of master's program classes. Now, initially he did this working alongside the same tutor who he had taken textual criticism classes with as an undergraduate, Percy Simpson. But by 1935, Lewis had taken sole responsibility for those classes. From Michaelmas term 1930 to Trinity term 1945, Lewis ran weekly classes on textual criticism with a focus on the first quarto of Hamlet from 1931 to 1935. From 1936 to 45, the Gazette simply signifies these under the broader title textual criticism. It's entirely possible that he was still teaching Hamlet as part of that as well. In addition to an Arden and a Cambridge Shakespeare edition of Hamlet and a copy of his larger Temple Shakespeare edition, Lewis had a fourth, a copy of the Bodley Head Quarto of Hamlet, edited by G.B. Harrison. There are annotations in each of those volumes. The work on the text and the question of a play with a multi-text history is evident in his annotations there. We see notes particularly pertaining to his preparation for these textual criticism classes, whether as an apprentice or simply recalled when he took them on as his sole responsibility. There's one line, for example, that reads, P.S., that's code for Percy Simpson, thinks this very suspicious, as there was only one Hamlet. Now, it's perhaps worth unpacking further some of the nature of the annotations Lewis makes in his Shakespeare editions. I've worked with all of the editions of his plays and poems in archives on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's not accurate to conclude, as Raphael Lynn did, that, quote, there is no connection between the notes made and Lewis's published work. Or, as Helen Cooper argued, that, quote, anyone expecting great insights into Lewis's mind, or even into his response to Shakespeare, will be disappointed. Rather more useful is Lionel Adie's assessment that these annotations are, quote, often stimulating. Lewis tended to use his Arden editions of the Shakespeare plays as those where he wrote most of his notes. And there we find him commenting not just on Shakespeare's plays, but also detailed textual matters and engagement with editors from the Arden, perhaps most notably with editors like John Dover Wilson, who was a primary textual editor for the then new Cambridge Shakespeare series. Some of these take the form of a footnote. Lewis adds a whole series of footnotes to his own pages. Some are comments on editorial matter. Others, again, are substantial lists of words, critical stances, or summaries of plays, which are most frequently found in the opening and closing flyleaves, those kind of empty pages that you get at the beginning of a book, of his ardent editions. On at least 2 occasions, he also includes illustrations as he tries to kind of picture the scenes or entire acts or plays. His primary mode of engaging with Shakespeare, like many of his contemporaries, was actually rather on the page than on the stage. So he was reading Shakespeare mostly, but he did see some in performance. Sometimes, in the more extended annotations, Lewis approaches something like a mini essay. This is especially notable in his 1935 edition of Othello. But to continue with using Hamlet as our kind of example here, we find him also there expressing his own views. So he writes, quote, and he's responding to what other critics have said at this point. My own view would be orthodox with some modifications. Hamlet is the tragedy of weakness. The weakness springs from disgust, from the haunting, from apparently despised love, and from fear of death. But this weakness is finally overcome. Hamlet's mind is made up when he is summoned to the duel, not that he foresaw what would there occur, but that he was ready to take the next opportunity. And finally, Lewis argues, this weakness is not to be regarded as anything abnormal, nor is all the delay to be laid to its charge, the journey to England being compulsory. The inner history of any great action performed by a man of the reflective type would be forced to contain all these timings and windings, all the soliloquies, oh, what no few and how all occasions, owe their endless appeal to the fact that we have all said them already to ourselves. So he frames Hamlet as a kind of everyman in that response. And this is Lewis's own response in his annotations. But Lewis's scholarship of Shakespeare was not just to students at Oxford, or indeed his own personal notes. In 1935, Lewis boldly took eminent Shakespeare scholar Dover Wilson to task, specifically his methods for determining whether or not something was written by Shakespeare. He writes a letter to the Times Literary Supplement. This is really directed to Dover Wilson and the wider academic community. And his letter goes on to spark a very heated debate for several months during this same year, not just between Lewis and Dover Wilson, but all other kinds of Shakespeare critics get involved. And it's not an overstatement to acknowledge, as Shakespeare scholar Gabriel Egan has, that Lewis sparked an important critical discussion, highlighting, quote, key objections to central tenets of new bibliography long before new textualism took hold in the 1980s. Critical discussions, therefore, that were at least 55 years ahead of their time. By 1939, Lewis had secured his reputation as a significant scholar of Shakespeare, such that he was invited to speak at the annual Shakespeare Conference in Stratford-upon-Avon. This is organized by G.B. Harrison and John Garrett, and they gather together academics, actors, school teachers, and theatre practitioners. Reports on the conference in the press emphasize the high caliber of speakers. Headlines read things like, brilliant scholars discuss Shakespeare in the local Banbury Guardian, or a very distinguished panel, fully representative of both the academic and the operative spheres of theatrical activity. Certainly then, amongst Shakespeare scholars and practitioners, Lewis was seen to be a scholar doing significant enough work on Shakespeare and his period to be invited to speak there. He was to give 2 papers, one August 31 on the Renaissance in Shakespeare, and one on the 1st of September on the play of the day, The Taming of the Shrew. It was a significant conference, and G.B. Harrison, one of its organizers, remembers in his memoir that the conference attracted some first-class speakers, among them C.S. Lewis and John Middleton Murray. It is, I think, significant that Lewis is only one of 2 scholars that Harrison mentions by name. His lecture on August 31 was widely reported in the national press. The Times noted that a person who wished to parody the lecture might, Mr. Lewis said, give it its true title, How the Renaissance Didn't Happen and Why Shakespeare Was Not Affected by It. Lewis himself wrote to his brother that it went down very well. And although the paper he gave has yet to be recovered, it's possible to piece together most of it from the content of newspaper reports. Much of it, of course, is also echoed in his opening chapter to the Oxford History of English Literature volume. Now, of course, on September the 1st, Germany invades Poland. Shortly thereafter, September the 3rd, Britain enters the Second World War. The conference is called off before Lewis has chance to give his second paper. That's probably, however, just as well, because he had complained only a month before to his friend Owen Barfield that it is difficult to make that tedious farce the peg to hang anything on. So perhaps he's pretty pleased he didn't have to get the paper. Another example of Lewis on Shakespeare in the public light, which has turned perhaps into his best-known publication on Shakespeare, comes to light in 1942, when, in the midst of his work on Paralandra, the Screwtick Letters, Preface to Paradise Lost, and his sermon, The Weight of Glory, Lewis was also invited to address the British Academy and deliver the annual Shakespeare lecture. To give this talk was a very high accolade. Other scholars who preceded him included something like a kind of who's who in significant Shakespeare scholars of the early 20th century. In this talk, entitled Hamlet, the Prince or the Poem, Lewis focused primarily on what critics have already said about the play, and then what his response to those critics is. More extendedly, he also is interested in what he sees to be the problematic state of criticism about that play. But really, he's focusing on that in order to redirect us back to the play, and to remind us again of what it is to find ourselves caught up, as he puts it. Lewis sets up a contrast between what he had previously mistaken to be the, quote, proper and grown-up way of understanding and appreciating Hamlet, and he contrasts this with his own childlike response, which he cautions is not sophisticated, abstract, and modern, but rather concrete and archaic. He focuses on the story, on the iconography or the imagery of the play, and he moves away from the then dominant trend and thread of character criticism, or focusing on the problem of Hamlet, the whys or wherefores of his procrastination. Unfortunately, Lewis, however, seems to undercut my entire argument I've just been building up about the validity of seeing him as a Shakespeare scholar by opening with a very direct, self-effacing apology. He apologizes for not being a true Shakespeare scholar. But, as I've written about this elsewhere, I think he's playfully being very rhetorical here. He's also politely disarming hundreds of years of Hamlet scholarship, much of it written by his very audience in that room, right? It's a pretty risky business. So, ultimately, I think in that lecture, Lewis's aim is to rehumanize Hamlet and to resist seeing the play as kind of a maze of motives, as he puts it. He imbues his reading with childish glee and wonder. He invites his audience to, quote, recall golden minutes which we stole from marking examination papers on Hamlet, to read a few pages of Hamlet itself. This is a literal example of turning away from the criticism and back to the play, which is a kind of leitmotif running throughout that whole lecture. Pushing this point still further, he rhetorically inquires, have we ever known the day or hour when its enchantment failed? No, is the implicit response, or at least his personal response. Now, Lewis had two further publications on Shakespeare, which I haven't mentioned, I just want to touch on briefly. First is a short piece on Shakespeare's imagery, in an essay which is first delivered to the Mermaid Club. It's called Variation in Shakespeare and Others. And there he contrasts Shakespeare's descriptions with those of other writers from his period and a little after, especially Milton, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Middleton, and Ben Jonson. He looks especially at the way that Shakespeare and these other writers construct images. And he basically argues that Shakespeare's approach might seem excessive, but is actually much more natural than a number of these other writers. He says, Shakespeare recognizes that real passion is not articulate. We stumble as we try and find the words, and so we have this repetition of phrases. And he argues that's much more natural than someone that lands precisely on the perfect word right away. And so he says, we must give a character poetic metaphors the air of being thrown off accidentally as he gropes for expression. That's what he argues Shakespeare does. And finally, in spite of its subtitle excluding drama, which has misled critics to conclude that, quote, Shakespeare was not one of Lewis's strengths, or that he chose to exclude drama from that volume due to his lack of knowledge of Shakespeare, Lewis does nonetheless deal very briefly with a handful of plays by Shakespeare in his Oxford History of English Literature volume. He also there gives substantial treatment to Shakespeare's narrative poems, especially Venus and Adonis, Rape of Lucrece, and the Sonnet. And then he gives a brief treatment of the Phoenix and the Turtle as well. In his discussion of the sonnets, Lewis again sees Shakespeare exploring a theme and varying his angle, his emphasis and his image in order to return to it and recapture that same theme within a poem. It's very much like the argument he starts putting forward in Variation. Dover Wilson, that same person who Lewis had earlier taken to task, goes on to esteem Lewis's own discussion of the sonnets later on. He credits Lewis as one of only 2 critics in his contemporary period to realize that Shakespeare's sonnet sequence is, quote, the greatest love poem in the language. So wholeheartedly does he agree with Lewis that his only response to the page-and-a-half passage he quotes from Lewis's Oxford History of English Literature is, quote, there is nothing a mere editor can add. That's particularly polite when we remember the way that Lewis has been taking him to task. Now, this is all kind of setting up so that you can see the kind of work that Lewis is doing on Shakespeare, and then why he might be appearing elsewhere in his canon, which is what I want to now turn to. So, in Narnia, we see an example of a wider trend. The trend that I began this talk with, that of Lewis using Shakespeare as a point of contact, or a point of reference. Interestingly, in Narnia, we find allusions to the Tempest, as well as a direct reference to A Midsummer Night's Dream, at least twice, including mention of Poor Bottom in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Winter's Tale, and most extendedly references to Hamlet, the play, its atmosphere, of which Lewis had already been writing extensively for his British Academy lecture. And we might consider cross-applying then the words of Ransom as he looks at Earth from the heavens and out of the silent planet. Quote, it was all there in that little disc. London, Athens, Jerusalem, Shakespeare. We might apply that to Lewis. Where we see in Lewis's writings the influence of a variety of English, London, Greek, Athens, we might extend this to the classics perhaps, Jerusalem, both scripture and the church, and yes, Shakespeare. Shakespeare is, you'll notice in that list from Ransom, the only non-location, the only named writer there, as though he somehow represents all the literature of the increasingly little world that Ransom is perceiving. So I want to take an example to start with from Letters to Malcolm. This comes from letter number 8. Quotations up on the screen for you. So in Letters to Malcolm, this of course is published posthumously, Lewis uses Shakespeare to highlight the way that he can feel sympathy, but to feign empathy and true fellow feeling would be worse than being false and pure insensitivity. And how in poor taste his reference to George's descendants fell if he is in a position where the length of his own life, let alone the life of any offspring, might be gifted with, is in question. But to explain how stark a response it would be, how cold, how ironically devoid of feeling, Lewis references Macbeth. Macbeth, who of course also has no descendants. Lewis is referring to a moment in Macbeth in this quotation here, where Macduff mourns the deep loss of his own wife and children, who Macbeth has had slaughtered. He questions the messenger who reports their death. All my pretty ones, he inquires, and the fact he has no children, it's wedged in the middle of his horror and his shock. Macduff, in doing so, indicates that Macbeth will never be able to fully grasp the loss he feels, for he has no children. No children to continue his line, but also no children to know what it is to lose children. Even if Macbeth cared and might feel some kind of remorse, and there's a sense in which he cannot feel Macduff's precise loss. To acknowledge the inability to totally feel exactly as the correspondent feels is, as Lewis suggests, better than feigning it. More like the real grasp of a hand of concern than the false pat of impossibly felt empathy. So it's just one small example. I want to come back to that example from the Four Loves, which you can see the lines of relevance up on the screen. Lewis's use of Shakespearean characters and plays in his apologetics reveals at least one Christian dimension of Shakespeare: his capacity to point, or to be used to help to point apologetically towards Christian truth and experience. One such example comes in The Four Loves, where Lewis self-consciously uses literary examples as touchstones. He is, we know, driven to literary examples to try and find that point of contact with his audience. He laments the loss of a shared frame of reference via scripture, or a shared even notion of God. But he hopes that shared literary references might somehow fill those gaps. The specific example he mentions prior to explaining his use of literary examples is the character of Lear from Shakespeare's King Lear. Lear, at the beginning of that play, is ravenous, as Lewis puts it, for public displays of affection from others. He demands that his daughters say how much they love him. He needs it, but he shows no understanding that affection depends upon common sense and give and take and decency. Although, as King Lear opens, he plans to divide his kingdom and it appears somehow relinquish his power, it's clear this is a kind of manipulative power play going on for another kind of power, emotional power here. Lewis's reference to King Lear in The Four Loves highlights one character and one moment in the play, but it's evident that he has the entirety of Act 1, Scene 1 in mind. Moreover, Lewis indicates the way that this scene, and Shakespeare's depiction of corrupted need-love, triggers the trajectory of the rest of the play. Throughout that play, the love offered to Lear by truly loving characters, people like Cordelia, his youngest daughter, Kent, and Edgar, suggests the inadequacy of his own need-love on its own. Furthermore, Lear does himself undergo a kind of transformation towards the end of that play. His own sufferings and his new community of beggars, fools, and exiles appear to move him emotionally and morally. He does come to recognize and feel not only his own dependence, but also the needs of his subjects and their dependence on his charity and affection. He realizes with, quote, climbing sorrow, the consequences of having taken, quote, too little care of the poor naked wretches of his kingdom. In The Four Loves, Lewis's brief reading of King Lear, it's only a couple of lines, is both effective and apologetic. Lewis's reframing of the story of Lear as a kind of parable of affection is moving. Part of that, perhaps, is a way that he prompts readers to recognize what the selfish loves of Lear, Goneril, and Regan might say about themselves. And in this way, we might also see him trying to move their hearts to desire something different, moving them towards and ultimately to God. Doubtless, Lewis hopes that his audience will respond feelingly to the divine love he points to, which is in sharp contrast to the love exhibited by Lear. But why Shakespeare? Why does Lewis keep coming back to Shakespeare? There is one particularly personal reason, which I haven't yet touched on, and is super important, I think. He does this especially in his Christian or apologetic works, but really, truthfully, he does it all over his canon. One of the reasons I think he does it specifically in his apologetics is that Shakespeare acted as a way-in for Lewis as well. And we see this especially in two readings of plays recorded in letters to his friend Arthur Greaves in the final run-up before Lewis's own conversion to Christianity. I'm going to give you one of those up on the screen here. He's talking about how he has recently been reading The Winter's Tale, and he says, I've also been studying The Winter's Tale. You remember the last scene where Hermione is introduced as a statue and then comes to life. Apologies for the spoiler of those who've never seen The Winter's Tale. Hitherto, I had thought it rather silly. This time, seeing that the absurdity of the plot doesn't matter and is merely the scaffolding whereby Shakespeare, probably unconsciously, is able to give us an image of the whole idea of resurrection, I was simply overwhelmed. I must confess that more and more the value of plays and novels becomes for me dependent on the moments when, by whatever artifice, they succeed in expressing the great myths. Lewis at this point is overwhelmed by this image of the whole idea of resurrection, as well as the play's capacity to express the great myths. He's also interested in Shakespeare's probably unconscious ability to point towards this numinous mythic event. At this moment for Lewis, Shakespeare gives us an image of that whole idea of resurrection, a miracle central to the Christian faith. Lewis concedes that Shakespeare probably does so unconsciously, and certainly only as part of a play, or that might be, and has earlier been, by Lewis himself, missed. Shakespeare creates a story and a structure that, according to Lewis, expresses the great myths. His response, and potentially others' response, is a certain shock and the overwhelming wonder of the possibility which Hermione's and Shakespeare's miracle points towards. His emotional reaction to that whole idea of resurrection, and the image Shakespeare gives us, does not, I think, necessarily conclude that this is resurrection in that play, but rather that it's an image which prompts one to think of it. But however we take it, Lewis indicates a deeply felt and apparently Christian response to this scene. That's from a letter dated September 5th, 1931. He also wrote the date that he finished reading The Winter's Tale at the end of his Arden edition, September 2nd, 1931. So this is very, very fresh from his reading. And I should mention that that letter is written before he has gone through that process of converting to Christianity. In the last letter, dated September 22nd, 1931, that Lewis writes to Greaves as a non-Christian, he writes about a recent rereading of Hamlet and, quote, the prevalent sense of death, solitude, and horror, alongside, quote, the extraordinary graciousness and lovableness of Hamlet himself. Lewis urges Greaves to, quote, just surrender yourself to the magic, regarding it as a poem or a romance. Truthfully, this same letter is better known for its discussion of that very same late-night walk with Dyson and Tolkien. But this mention of Hamlet, in a letter so concerned with metaphor and myth and faith, is really important, I think, to consider as another text that points towards eternal matters. Hamlet, so wedded in Lewis's mind with conceptions of the relationship between God and humanity, as we saw right at the beginning, is perhaps unsurprisingly a significant text for him, perhaps even a kind of myth that Lewis was considering deeply just prior to his conversion. For Lewis, the atmosphere of myth and magic in The Winter's Tale and Hamlet were significant experiences in his mind and imagination before, during, and after his conversion. And they formed part of the larger story that framed his own journey to Christian belief. It's not therefore surprising, perhaps, that he keeps coming back to Shakespeare. Resurrection, or the mythic miraculous quality of Shakespeare's image, strikes Lewis very, very hard on these two readings, especially that reading Winter's Tale. And he's overwhelmed at what this moment in the play has the capacity to convey. As Lewis experienced, the play and its maybe miracle has the capacity to point towards glory and to overwhelm us with wonder. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that the presence of Shakespeare can be felt deeply across Lewis's life and across his writings. And it's perhaps not all that surprising that Lewis came back again and again to Shakespeare in his own reflections, in his grapplings for frames of reference that he might share with others, as an author whose works, both staged and especially read, had affected him really deeply, and whose stories have captured the haunting realities of the great myth for Lewis, whose plays, plots, and characters had indeed been part of his own story. I want to close with a reason as to why I think he does this, especially in his apologetics. So, when I was attending Our Lady of Guadalupe, there was a priest there, Father Robert DeLong, who often had these kind of circuitous unpackings of the gospel reading. And yet, as he blended in his own moving and often harrowing stories of his service in Vietnam, his coming to faith, his work as a nurse on the streets of Chicago, somehow every time they were effective, you found yourself deeply moved. And he always circled back to a repeated refrain that we are only here by the grace of God. Now he's no longer here. His messages still remain in the hearts of all who heard him, because he tied in his own life and experience, but he also very directly aligned it with our own lives and experiences. Almost without fail, every week he would angle back to a very directed point towards everyone present. Just think, when you're in Walmart, what if someone comes to you or just sees you and says, hey, didn't I see you at church on Sunday? Aren't you a Christian? He was, of course, getting us to think about what it means to be seen, to represent Christ, to be a believer beyond the Mass on Sunday. Lewis, of course, thought too about very tangible ways to get us to sense that gravity as well as honor of what it means to be a witness. But that repeated by the grace of God refrain that he also included was something that Lewis thought about throughout his life. He thought too about how that impression is left for us in the stories of those who behave with Christ-like sacrifice. He makes this point, for example, about an unnamed first servant in King Lear in his essay, The World's Last Night, which is worth checking out if you haven't. And the impression of the wonder and sacrificial power of what grace has led to for us, what it might lead us to do. He also saw, through literary example, the reality of the miracle of resurrection. Of Christ, yes, but also our own resurrection through Christ's sacrificial death and resurrection, particularly through Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. Now, Father Robert, of course, taught us that you appeal to your audience. Jesus, of course, also taught us that with his parables, but the two work in tandem, and both use familiar examples to really hammer home the message. Lewis is also seeking this familiar example to really get through to people. And truthfully, without fail, every time I go into Walmart, I remember his words again. I remember their significance in that application too. And Lewis knew that this is the way that the human heart works, right? And this is how we remember things also. And so as he shows us the wonder, and he shows us how he feels that wonder in response to it represented in Shakespeare's texts, he's trying to, again, make that point of contact and that point of relationship with his own audience. He sees and he knows that in part because he had seen something of the wonder of the grace of God and Christ's sacrifice and what it means to be resurrected beings and to live as resurrected beings. All of those people knew that we needed these great myths, these stories, to show us something more of the miracle, of the wonder, of the magic, of what it is to be shown the grace of God. And to feel the softening of the stone, just like in Winter's Tale, the stone, Hermione reawakens, as we too are reawakened miraculously to new life. And the primary example where Lewis is doing that in terms of this literary example in The Fool Loves is King Lear, and throughout his canon, he keeps coming back again and again to Shakespeare. Thank you very much.
So remember, when the microphone reaches you, you say your name, major, and then you ask your question. Just going to get this started. Student? Okay. Sorry. Look very professorial.
Hello, my name is Michael Pearsall. Thank you for your talk. I am a philosophy major. I know you had the quote from The Winter's Tale, and you mentioned that was one of Lewis's favorite works. Is that quote the main reason why he liked The Winter's Tale? Because I know The Winter's Tale is, like, at least in my opinion, one of the lesser-known Shakespeare plays.
No, that's a really good question. I think, based on the way that he also reads Hamlet and other Shakespeare plays, he does really appreciate that particular moment where we see the statue coming back to life and just the shock of what that means. But he truthfully doesn't appreciate that until he's read it several times before. And I think partly what he's also struck with is the kind of atmosphere of that play as well. There's lots of unlikable things about that play, right? Leontes is a horrible, horrible person, and we're not supposed to think he's very nice. And we're supposed to want the hope that comes at the end. But I think that it's the about turn as well that Lewis especially appreciates. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Father Dominic Werner, professor of theology. And in thinking about how Shakespeare was able to provide a kind of common kind of storehouse of images and that Lewis could use to kind of make inside jokes with his father and also kind of illustrate other themes and topics more effectively. I kind of bemoan the fact that like Walmart is the is the example that we have today, you know. But I get it. You're right, I get it. But I'm wondering if did Lewis in any way intend for? I mean, maybe this would be too grandiose a kind of intention, but did he ever intend for his writings to be able to serve that purpose, perhaps by writing children's literature, where, you know, we can think of maybe some area of literature that might provide a common reference point. Perhaps children's literature might be the last remaining bastion. So just curious, did Lewis see in writing like the Chronicles of Narnia, for instance, that he might be providing a kind of common, I don't know, myth for the everyman?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think we have other myths aside from Walmart, so I think we have got hope. Yeah. But I take your point, and I mean, I think what's interesting to me is that we've almost got this kind of Lewis himself has become a reference point when you look at apologetics today, right, where he becomes almost one of the most frequently cited sources, and there's a sort of assumed, well, everyone knows who Aslan is, right, context within that. But I don't know whether he necessarily envisaged that becoming a thing. I suppose he would say, well, he's simply retelling a story that will right? So when we have the story of a dying and rising God, for him that was one of the things that really struck him. In lots of ways, what he's doing in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is simply retelling that story, right? In a different context, what would that look like in a world full of animals? But I think also what's interesting, and this kind of pertains to how he uses Shakespeare in children's literature as well, he'll make a reference to Hamlet. Now, your average child who is reading that, let's say they're 7 years old, isn't necessarily going to know Hamlet, right? But they're later going to read Hamlet and say, oh, hang on, I remember that reference to that, and this is what it means now, and then have that extra layer. Just like, oh, a dying and rising king? What does that mean, right? And they haven't necessarily computed those two things. So he suggests, and I think that's partly perhaps the longevity of those stories, because they don't necessarily explicitly always paint it direct. And people resist that, right? They need something that suggests rather than hits them over the head. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathy Toner. I was wondering, I find that a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies and dramas, and especially comedies, really have a lot of thematic similarities to kind of Lewis's style and approach to writing. What do you think is his approach more to some of the histories, especially the less dramatic or the slightly drier ones that we can find value in reading in the past, but like specifically with Lewis's approach to literature?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Lewis primarily writes more about and appreciates more the comedies and tragedies, but it's not the case that he didn't then engage also with the history plays as well. And I think part of it is he's interested in what kind of morals is Shakespeare capturing in those plays, right? He shows us bad kings and what happens to them. But he also shows kings that are bad because they're too weak, right? And they let themselves get pushed around. And the tragedy of Richard II, for example, right, is he didn't necessarily foresee what was so bad that was going to come in his kingdom, at least the way that Shakespeare paints that story, right? But also, Lewis writes quite directly about the fact that Shakespeare is definitely angling history, right? He is not giving us history as was. The other thing I'd say is that Lewis was of the opinion, which is not uncommon in his period, that Falstaff was a really, really good guy. That has shifted dramatically in Shakespeare criticism as well, so you can also use it to kind of track, okay, what were people thinking in his period? He isn't always in alignment with it. And he's above and beyond anything else when he's looking at Shakespeare. He is thinking about textual matters and so on. He's really interested in the story, which is a sort of general approach that Lewis has to literature, I think.
Hello, thanks for the talk. And so I'm Benedict, a declared humanities. And you quoted from Out of the Silent Planet. When Ransom was in space, he said, I see London, Athens, Jerusalem, and Shakespeare.
Right?
Yeah. And so I was, and you said that it was like Athens is reason and Jerusalem is like scripture. So, like, do you think that what he meant was like, Athens being the natural reason basis of Western civilization, and then Jerusalem being the scriptural revelation? And do you think he was saying that on purpose to sort of combat a sort of enlightenment sort of mentality, and also trying to encourage the collective like anthology of common stuff, so that way you can just like stick to the common culture of Christianity?
That's a great question. I was actually mostly being lazy in my assessment of what those things represented, right? So I was basically saying, well, this is kind of like that, and I think you're absolutely right that he is doing something a lot deeper than I did with my very surface level thing. I also want you to write that paper because I think it'll be really good. But I think that he's trying to what are the kind of tenets as we look down? What are the things that are absolutely significant to what human civilization is? And obviously, we can't see that, right? We certainly can't see Athens from space. There's no way. But I think you're right that he is being suggestive by picking four things, he could have picked anything, right? And he could have simply listed the continents, for example. But I think there is some significance in those locations that he picks and the associations we have with those locations as well.
Hi there, my name's Andrew Horn, and I loved your talk, so thank you. On your your first slide, where there was this alleged the misquotation that Walter Hooper got exercised about, if I'm right, based on what you were reading, it seems like Lewis has regularized the meter, as well as adding the my, right?
Well spotted, yeah.
Right. Yes. You kind of answered this already, but I had no idea that Lewis taught textual criticism so much, and it seems so very much at variance with his persona in his published works. And I'm thinking of that well-known passage where he says, "Never trust a philologist," was one of the first lessons I learned. So I don't know if you wanted to just say more about the place of textual criticism in Lewis's life.
Sure, yeah, no, that's a really good question. You're not unusual in not knowing that he did it, right? It's not particularly common knowledge. I'm an anomaly in knowing it, I think. Although now you will know it, so I'm sorry about that. It's a curse. But I think it's interesting that not only was this a significant responsibility, but he's doing it with graduate students, right? So he's doing it in a level of detail that that will be significantly beyond what you would expect an undergraduate to be engaging with. And he does it not just with Shakespeare, but also with Chaucer. He does it in other times with Milton as well. So it's something he's thinking about as a kind of disciplinary approach to some of these early texts. The comment on the philologist is mostly a kind of slap at Tolkien, right? But that's partly because when we look at what Lewis is doing with textual criticism, he teaches it. He then has this kind of gap where he's not teaching it. But you might remember that one of his last published works is Studies in Words, right, where he's thinking about etymology of words and so on. So he kind of carries it on, but in a slightly different approach. And that's based on a series of lectures that he gave at Cambridge later in his career. So I think it is something he's interested in, even if he doesn't write extensively about it. But yeah, not what we think of when we think of Lewis, that's for sure.
Thank you very much. My name is Father Jordan Zajac. I'm in the English department. I'm a Shakespearean by trade and a lover of Lewis as an amateur, but I've also taught on Lewis. So I don't know how you have time to, knowing how much it takes to master Shakespeare and then to put Lewis on top of that and how much he wrote. I don't know how you have time to cycle or do anything else. But so that's super impressive, and thank you for this great talk. I've never, I've thought about Lewis as a writer, never as a critic. Or I know him, Milton, things like that, but never as a Shakespeare critic. Sad to say. I love, when I'm teaching introduction to literature, I love to start the semester, especially in the spring term, start with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, baptize the students' imaginations, and then end the semester with The Winter's Tale. And I had never thought about, it's clear that the latter is informing the former. So I was prepared to come in today and ask you about, what has Lewis published on, or what does he speak or write about, Winter's Tale. But actually, the way you what you did present with that letter to Greaves, it's not so much what Lewis had to say about the Winter's Tale, but it's in that moment pre-conversion. It's you can think of what is the Winter's Tale saying to him, right? Paulina in that scene before the big reveal tells all those characters, you must awaken your faith. Right? And it's as if like Paulina is speaking to unconverted Lewis. That's just profound to me. It's more of a comment than a question, but absolutely spectacular. So just thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unless I missed something, all of the plays that you referenced that Lewis discusses or refers to were either tragedies or romances. But does he reference comedies anywhere? Or is there someplace in Lewis's works where the comedies come up a lot? And if so, where?
Yeah, I think that's basically true when you look at the overall tracking of his texts. But if you throw in his correspondence, to the mix, of which he had vast quantities of correspondence, you will find him essentially referencing the history plays that we were thinking about a bit earlier, and also the comedies as well. And mostly as a kind of butt of a joke. So you'll see him referencing, like Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. We see that in Narnia, but it's not something that he's necessarily consistently doing throughout his other writings. I think also probably in part what's going on is it's indebted to what Lewis is reading, which isn't to say that he doesn't read the comedies. He has a very, very detailed notes, for example, on Love's Labour's Lost, which he thinks about quite a lot. Again, not as well-known text. I mentioned Two Gentlemen right near the beginning, and he has very, very extended notes on that as well. He doesn't publish on them, but he's clearly thinking about these texts. But I think when we see what he's doing, he's also thinking about plays that other people will know. And in that period, the tragedies were more highly critical than the comedies. So I think it's partly also just like, okay, people know Macbeth, I'll make a reference to Macbeth, rather than Lewis doesn't necessarily know those plays. So he does really appreciate the comedies, he just isn't writing on them so much, except jokes.
Hi, thank you. Elsie McLaughlin, I'm a staff here. I have a sort of a technical research question. I actually did my undergraduate at Oxford, so I'm kind of like familiar with the libraries, and you were mentioning not just Lewis's personal Shakespeare copies and his annotations, but also some things you were citing from what was set for the examinations. So I was just wondering, where is this kind of archival material held? Is it at the Bodleian? What's in the U.S.? Where did you have to go to undertake this research?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. You probably also, therefore, know considerably more about the assessment process at Oxford than I do. The examination statutes and the gazettes are now on open shelves in Duke Humphrey's library, which is the oldest library in the Bodleian. If you have seen the Harry Potter movies and you didn't go to Oxford, that's where they filmed Hogwarts Library. That's why people get excited about it. It's also just a nice library. Lewis spent a lot of time researching the library as well, so it's kind of nice that that's where they are. Big, big volumes, really hard to search because they're not indexed very well. So I spent many, many months, and the very generous librarian, this was during quite a lot of this works of 2021, just after the libraries had reopened, after they shut down for obviously a long time during the pandemic. And you weren't allowed to go into Duke Humphreys and move the books out of there at the time. And so this poor, very generous librarian offered to carry them for me, because they're very, very heavy volumes. So that's where those things are. But in terms of Lewis's copies of Shakespeare, none of them are currently held in Oxford. There are some copies of his own library, which are being catalogued at the moment, but none of those are Shakespeare volumes. So these are held split between the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College, who have the largest collection of Lewis and other connected writers, the 7 writers. They bought rather a lot of Lewis's copies of really everything. This happens to include Shakespeare, that were previously sold to Roxton College, and when Roxton College went under, the Wade Center bought those volumes. Unfortunately, in the interim period, other people started writing these books. So you got Lewis's annotations, but there's other kind of student underlinings and scribbles and so on. So it makes it a little difficult, and for those less familiar with Lewis's handwriting, sometimes people conclude that he wrote something that he didn't write, someone else has written it in. The others are at Magdalen College, Cambridge, in England. And that's mostly because the story goes, and I'm still trying to dig to the bottom of this, because it's not exactly clear. The story goes that when Lewis left Magdalen, when he took retirement, he asked them, you can have any of my books that you want, what do you want? And they said, very cheekily, we'll have your complete works of Shakespeare, please. But Walter Hooper reports that they got the Temple edition of Shakespeare. That's not true, that's at the Wade, and they never had it. Magdalen have no record as to why they got the books in the first place. So I'm still digging. This is the subject of an article, but they have mostly Arden editions and New Cambridge Shakespeare editions. So some of the books that they originally had, at least one of them they had and has now gone. And this is because until very recently, they were lending them out to undergraduates as well. So they're now in secure storage in their old library at the archive there. But yeah, basically, at Wheaton and in Cambridge is where those books.
Last question goes to Dr. Dever.
I'm Dr. Colum Dever, also in the theology department here at Providence. And I was wondering, I love the exchange between you and Father Jordan about the significance of the End of the Winter's Tale and resurrection and, the aptly named Paulina's invitation to faith. I was wondering the extent to which there might be a resonance, or like in your judgment, there might also be a resonance like with the Pygmalion myth of like an invitation to creativity, or like to enter into a created world that's kind of also again, you gave us the great passage about the great myth and the resurrection, and this is like what's really potent. But I was wondering the extent to which you thought that there might also be something that really drew him into that ending as an artist, as a kind of invitation to then work into Aslan's invasion of the witch's castle at the end of Narnia, that like, yes, there's the resurrection image, but also kind of to write a story in which you're invited to enjoy the atmosphere and to participate in it in some way. Like, how did it appeal to him, not only as someone kind of on the cusp of religious faith, but also as an artist?
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And I mean, I think because we see him do that with the atmosphere of other plays in his fiction, I think there's definitely something in that as well. And he writes, thinking about what it means to kind of be a co-creator, right, as well. So I think it definitely is channeling that. I haven't thought about that, but it's a great point. I will pinch it if you don't write it. No, I'm joking. I won't really. But he does this with Hamlet, for example. He imports the atmosphere of death in the last act. So I think it's definitely something he even if he's not doing it necessarily totally subconsciously all the time, I think it's definitely the back of his mind. So yeah, for sure.
So two things. The second thing is, please join us down the hall for hors d'oeuvres. The first thing is, please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Waters.